So tonight we're talking about fulfilled prophecy from the Bible. So this is pretty exciting. I love this kind of stuff because it's stuff that, I'd like to say skeptics can't argue with, but they can pretty much argue with anything. But it's evidence. I love evidence because just self-affirming data, but also stuff I can use when talking to people. Several weeks ago, before we went on the holiday break, we talked about evidence for the Bible, and I had touched on archaeological evidence, historical evidence, and physical evidence for the Bible being true. The Bible being true, accurate, and reliable. But I didn't touch on prophecy mainly because there's just so much to say about this one topic that I couldn't really bring up the subject and do it justice with only a few minutes. I really wanted to block out a good amount of time to talk about this because it's so cool. And there's so much to talk about. So tonight and next week, I'll be dividing the topic up, and we'll be really diving into this exciting and important topic to further support the evidence that we have. I think it's important that we reflect on all that God has promised and all that he has already fulfilled. Similar to how we need to be intentional about remembering what he's already done in our lives and how he's answered prayers, because we tend to have really short memories. I can't tell you how many mountains that I've witnessed God move in my own life, but I inevitably get rocked by something that's just so small in comparison because I forget the stuff that he's already done. Maybe just in the moment, or I just can't retain information as like I should be able to. The disciples did this too, though, if you think about it. Shortly after witnessing Jesus perform miracles, they would panic and freak out because they were focusing on what was right in front of them rather than what God had already shown them and done in their lives. Even after seeing Jesus resurrect people from the dead, they all scattered and cowered in fear after his crucifixion. I want to begin by mentioning that the Bible is unique in a variety of ways. There's no other book in history, period, that has specific prophecies that have come to pass and also does not contain a single prophecy that has not or could not occur. You'll never find a prophecy in the Bible that should have happened but didn't. The Bible has a 100% success rate. That alone is evidence that the Bible is divinely inspired, because if it was written by man, there's just no way. There's the famous saying, to err is human. We're flawed. We mess up all the time, but the Bible does not contain these human errors that we would expect if it was just written. It is written by men, but I mean if it was just, if it all came from man instead of from God. So the Bible isn't just some book. There are still prophecies that have yet to come to pass, but there's never been one that failed to happen. The Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy calculated that about 27% of the Bible is prophecy or predictive. And in the Old Testament alone, there are 353 prophecies just dealing with the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'm obviously not going to sit down and list them all for you tonight, but if you're interested in looking them up, it just takes a couple Google searches to find a comprehensive list that you could always, finger through if you want. The first verse that we'll be looking at tonight, though, is Isaiah 52, and we'll specifically be starting in verse 13. In it, we find a description of a character who's known as the sin-bearing servant, and today we know it is referring to Jesus Christ. As I read the verses, I want you to keep a question in the back of your mind. Just ask yourself, if there is any other person in all of human history that could fit this description. I think you'll find that only Jesus fits this this prophecy. So start off in verse 13. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. First, I'd like to just mention that it says, my servant. Jesus came to serve, not to be served. Verse 14, just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So the visage also can mean his face. This doesn't mean Jesus was beaten worse than anyone has ever been beaten in human history. What it means is there was so much swelling, so much blood and wounds that he was unrecognizable as a man. That's what this phrase is talking about. You would look at him on the cross and you would say, what the heck is that? That doesn't even look like a human being. He was so beaten, you couldn't even recognize him as a man. Verse 15, so shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him. For what had been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider. This phrase might go right over our head when we read it without really knowing the context. But when the Israelites came out of Egypt and the law was given to the priests, one of the things they'd have to do is take blood from a sacrificial offering, an animal, and sprinkle it on people for the purpose of the blood temporarily covering their sins and restoring them in relationship with God. But it was always temporary because it was just animals' blood. But Jesus' blood covers all of our sins forever because his sacrifice was perfect. So when it says he shall sprinkle many nations, he's covering our sin, covering all of the nation's sin. Also, it says kings shall shut their mouths at him. This verse, what it literally means is when someone sees something so shocking and they gasp and they cover their mouth. This is the kind of shutting their mouth that it's referring to. So it's not exactly what it sounds like, but okay, we'll go over to the next chapter. Um, 53. Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He has no form or comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. I don't know if any of you have read this and realized that Jesus was likely an ugly man, or at least not attractive. Which just kind of speaks to the humble nature of Christ. He came in all humility, didn't even come as this beautiful person, like the pictures that Mormons have on their walls. It's a pretty attractive looking man, but in reality, Jesus was probably not very good looking, so that none of us would desire him. You contrast this to someone like Saul, who was very tall and really attractive, but he was a terrible king. We'll skip down to verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. You remember how during the trial, Jesus didn't open his mouth to defend himself. And I just want to point out real quick, because I can already hear the skeptics attack, because they think what we say is that during all of the story of Jesus, everything that happened, that he never spoke at all. That's not what we're saying. During his trial, he did not speak to defend himself. That's very different. Because if he did speak to defend himself, then he would have been found innocent, and they could not have possibly have killed him. But he he kept his mouth shut so that he would be slaughtered because he had to be slaughtered for our salvation. Now, Isaiah was written between 740 BC and 700 BC. And we know this because of the things that are mentioned in the texts that were happening in the world, such as the Babylonian conquest, but also because of other ancient sources and texts that confirm the details of what was recorded in Isaiah. Scholars can also compare texts to writings that were similar in style and that came from the same time period, and they can tell you whether it's consistent. You know, today we use certain slang or words that are common. I'm not even hip on all of the new stuff, but I'm sure you can think of one. And in 100 years or 1,000 years from now, people are probably going to be like, what were they trying to say when they said that stupid thing? The vast majority of scholars agree that the book of Isaiah was written well before the time of Jesus. So there's not even any skeptics out there that are like, oh no, this was written after Jesus. The main argument they will have for this book is that this wasn't referring to Jesus, it was referring to someone else. So, but remember the question I asked you to keep in the back of your head is if there was anyone else in all of history I didn't read it all, but that all of it could have applied to. There's no one else other than Jesus that it could have. The next one we're going to go to is Psalm 22. And this one, I get really excited when I talk about this one because it actually answered a question that I had back when I was a baby Christian for many years, when I would read Matthew 27:46, and Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? I always thought that Jesus was having doubts or basically faltering or wavering in the last moments, and it just confused me because of what I understood Jesus to be, which was fully man but also fully God, and that he knew what he was getting himself into, that he did it willingly and knowingly. And when I learned that he was quoting a psalm, and I read that psalm, it felt almost like a weight lifted off, or I was just super excited because that nagging question in my head had finally been answered, and it so clearly and obviously points to Jesus. It's clearly talking about Jesus and the crucifixion. So I'll read it for you real quick. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and am not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our fathers trusted you. They trusted you, and you delivered them. They cried to you, and were delivered. They trusted in you, and were not ashamed. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men, and despised by my people. All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. But you are he who took me out of the womb. You made me trust while on my mother's breast. I was cast upon you from birth, from my mother's womb. You have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It has melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. I'm reading King James Version, so apologize. I don't know what the heck that is. And my tongue clings to my jaws. You have brought me to the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far from me. O my strength, hasten to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth and from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered me. Okay, so I've read it, but now I'm going to back up and go over a few things because there's some imagery used there, and just a casual reading through, you may not catch a lot of it without being an ancient Hebrew who understands a lot of the things they're talking about. So in verse 6, "But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised by my people." Obviously, Jesus was despised by the Jews because they called for his murder rather than a criminal named Barabbas, who had actually committed a heinous crime. Verses 7 and 8 says, "All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, 'He trusted in the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him.'" In Mark 31 and 32, the chief priests mock Jesus by saying, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross." Then later in verse 36, some people who are standing by, they hear Jesus quote the psalm and say, "Let us see if Elijah will come and take him down." So this is obviously fulfilling of that. Anyway, so then in verse 12 and 13, "Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They gape at me with their mouths like a raging and roaring lion." So the Cambridge Bible for schools and colleges has a commentary on these verses, which says, "He compares his insolent enemies to wanton bulls, which are in the habit of gathering in a circle around any novel or unaccustomed object, and may easily be irritated into charging with their horns." So if you know that context, it makes a lot more sense. You know, they kind of just gather around like a crowd watching something terrible happening, and then just they're easily irritated, like by the color red, they'll just charge right at it. I don't know if that's true or just a myth. Verse 14, "I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax that has melted within me." In 2021, we can look at the verse that describes Jesus being stabbed with a spear and water mixed with blood coming out of the wound, and we can actually explain how this happens with our modern understanding of medical conditions. There's a condition called hypovolemic shock. I knew I was going to mess it up. Which is a term that refers to low blood volume. In other words, the person would lose so much blood that they actually start to go into shock. The effects of this would be the heart would start to beat faster to try to just pump the blood that's not there, and the person would experience extreme thirst. They would likely faint and collapse because of lack of blood pressure, and the kidneys would start to shut down to preserve body fluids. Jesus needed help in carrying the cross due to this decreased blood pressure from his severe floggings and beatings. He also declared that he was extremely thirsty while he was on the cross in John 19:28. Before the person dies from this condition, the rapid heartbeat that's caused by the shock would cause fluid to begin to gather in the sac around the heart and around the lungs. This explains why water came out when the Roman soldier stabbed Jesus' side. Now, this is an ancient text. They had no modern understanding of medicine. There were no antibiotics. It was just very, very primitive. And there's no way they would know what hypovolemic shock is. But they describe something that happened that in that day probably would have just sounded like either a myth or something that's just made up. It doesn't make any sense. They certainly couldn't have explained it. But today we look at it and we know exactly what it is because we have this understanding of medicine. So it's just really cool that you find things like that when you go through the Bible. The verse that says that his blood is poured out like water. Doesn't mean that he was literally poured out like water, or that every single, bone in his body was out of joint, because the words that are used, the word like, they use the word let me just read it. I am poured out like water. My bones are all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. So there are times the Bible is trying to use metaphors or symbolic examples, and times when it's being literal. And when it's using the word like several times in a verse, it's trying to be symbolic. It's not trying to say that this was literally happening. I mean, in some ways, it did literally happen, because when he was stabbed, water came out of him as blood, mixed with blood. So, but it's not intended to be taken literally, is what I'm trying to get through. These metaphors just symbolize that all of his strength and his vigor was gone and sapped out of him. In verse 16, it says, "For dogs have surrounded me, the congregation of the wicked has enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet." Right away, you see the pierced my hands and my feet, and you think, well, obviously Jesus. With this dog metaphor, what in the world is that? Dogs were basically often used as metaphors in the Bible for unclean or lesser people. When the psalmist is saying, when he's saying that he's surrounded by savage beasts. The word used for pierced has been contested by many who want to say that the more appropriate word instead of pierced is the word lion when we translate it to English. So the verse should say something more like a lion at my hands and feet. Now, they claim that Christians changed the word to fit a messianic interpretation, but the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has since proven that lion was not the proper use of the word. And as a matter of fact, the lion usage of the word didn't start to occur until 900 years after Christ in the Masoretic texts, which is like the Jewish texts, people who stayed Jews, Messianic Jews or Masoretic Jews. And these would be Hebrew and Aramaic texts. Psalm 22 was written before 587 BC, and most scholars believe it was actually approximately 1,000 years before Christ. Verse 18, it says, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Well, in Matthew 27:35, it says they casted lots for Jesus' clothes. By the way, there's something that I heard another apologist say about this whole lion thing and the piercing thing. Even so, if the word was lion, which it's not, it's just historically not true. I mean, it's just at the time that that Psalm 22 was written, at the time of Jesus, and up until 900 years after the time of Jesus, it was always pierced. That's just the facts. But even if it wasn't, these skeptics, they try to say, oh, it should actually be like a lion at my hands and my feet. Well, it turns out you actually have to change a lot of words in order to make it, because the verse wouldn't make any sense if it was just you swap out the pierced for lion. It just doesn't make sense. So you actually have to change the whole verse, and then when you start doing that, it's just not true to the original at all. But even if it was lion, I heard this apologist say, even if we did ignore all the evidence and bury our head in the sand and say, sure, it's lion, what do lions do? Like a lion at my hands and my feet, what are they doing? They're going to bite my hands and my feet, which would pierce my hands and my feet. I just figured I'd mention it real quick because it's a good point. But it's not. Evidence proves it. Once we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was undeniable proof. Okay, verse 27. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before you. This has happened. There are people from all over the world who have turned to the Lord. I come from a German and an Irish background, which has, both of them, has deep pagan roots. And here I am in 2020 America as a German-Irish immigrant, worshiping the Hebrew God. Yeah, I would say that that's happened, that all the ends of the world have begun to worship God. Okay, now I'm going to shift over to the destruction of Tyre. Now, this occurs in Ezekiel 26, and it's even titled A Prophecy Against Tyre. Now, Ezekiel 26, 1 through 21, was written between 593 and 562 BC, during Ezekiel's captivity in Babylon. The prophecy of the destruction of Tyre specifically was written in March or April of 587 BC. There's a lot of people that, skeptics or non-skeptics, that talk about how Ezekiel, the whole book, was written in 3 different parts. I'm talking about this one part, not the entire book, and this is when this part was written. And Tyre was a very important city and was the capital of the Phoenician Empire, which made up the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. I tried to get a picture to illustrate it. Couldn't find one that was quality, that was worth using. But just looking at a map of the Mediterranean Sea, they were all the way on the right side, kind of over by Israel. They controlled all of the trade in that area, and they had a really strong navy. They were basically the trade hub. They were very rich and wealthy. For 2,000 years, no one had been able to defeat Tyre and get in because it had such mighty walls, and they were famous. I mean, they were famous for being impressive and impregnable. They were said to be 20 inches thick at the base and 150 feet high. 20 feet thick, sorry. Not very impressive if it's 20 inches thick. 20 feet thick at the base and 150 feet high. Okay, verse 2, I'm going to go right over there. It says, Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, Aha, the gate to the nations is broken, and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. Okay, so this is Tyre saying, Ha ha, you Jerusalem, you're all messed up and you're broken, and now I'm going to prosper because of it. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves. So first I want to point out, notice the words that are used in that verse. Many nations will come up against you, and as the sea causes its waves to come up. So what does that mean? It means many nations as in like waves of attacks are going to come, or judgment. Now, many skeptics try to say that this whole proclamation failed. All of Ezekiel, the prophecy against Tyre failed, because it says that, or what they say is that Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to do everything that happens in this verse. But after we go through it together, you'll see that Nebuchadnezzar had a part to play, and these other nations had a different part. So verse 5, well, I'll read verse 4. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. I will scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. And then verse 5, out in the sea she will become a place to spread fish nets. For I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. She will become plunder for the nations. Out in the sea she will become a place to spread fish nets. So this means that the city of Tyre will be underwater. You know, they're spreading fish nets. They're fishing there now. People aren't living there. This means if the prophecy came true, then we should find Tyre underwater today. Well, that's exactly what we do find. And I'll touch on this more once we go through the rest of the chapter. Verses 6 through 11. And her settlements on the mainland will be ravaged by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. For this is what the sovereign Lord has said. From the north I'm going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. He will ravage your settlements on the mainland with a sword. He will set up siege works against you, build a ramp up to your walls, and raise his shields against you. He will direct the blows of his battering rams against your walls and demolish your towers with his weapons. His horses will be so many that they will cover you with dust. Your walls will tremble at the noise of the war horses, wagons, and chariots when he enters your gates as men enter a city whose walls have been broken through. The hooves of his horses will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with a sword, and your strong pillars will fall to the ground. Okay, so Tyre is made up of two parts, essentially. There was this mainland city, and they also had an island just off of the coast. And I've got a picture to illustrate it. Now, I don't know how well you can see if you're at home. Hopefully it's big enough. But the big yellow section on top, bubble, points to the original coast of the island and the original coast of the mainland. And why they're not separated by water anymore, I'll get into in a moment. Now, you also have the yellow bubble at the bottom, which points to a white section. That is actually the old Tyre, and it's now under the water, as you can see. And this is for a couple of reasons. There was an earthquake, which made the southern portion sink, but also this bridge, which created kind of more of a peninsula, affected how soil was deposited and how erosion happened. So anyway, you can still see the remnants of the old city. It's now underwater. All right, now Nebuchadnezzar, he laid siege to Tyre, the old Tyre, which was the mainland, which is over here on the right. He laid siege to that, and what that means is he didn't just attack it, he surrounded it, and the siege actually went on for 13 years. So it was a very long one. It began in 586 BC. And the way they would do things is instead of just charging the gates or the walls and getting picked off and both sides losing a whole bunch of people, they would just surround them and kind of starve them out, because all their farms are outside of the city or outside of the gates, and they have no way of bringing the food in if you cut them off and you surround them. And so eventually what they would have to do is they'd either starve to death, or maybe they would say, we don't have any options, we got to attack, and they just come out and attack you in the field, but they're weak, they're disadvantaged, they have to leave their walls, or they just give up. They say, come on in, you just take over. So eventually the city would run out of supplies, and they'd either have to give up or they would just lose. But what happened is, since they had this island off the coast, and they had such a strong navy, they could just easily keep bringing resources to the town. They also, most of the people in the town actually started to move over to the island. It went on 13 years. They had to get on at some point. They figured the city is going to be lost eventually. We got to get out of there. They were afraid. Not everyone. There were still many people there, but most of the people fled the mainland. And so Nebuchadnezzar eventually, he gets in, and he totally destroys the city. He kills everyone that's there. All that's left by the time he's done is just rubble. He pulls all of the buildings down, all the walls down. He totally destroys the place. But he did not take over the island. And so this is where a lot of skeptics are like, no, Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to take them all out and do all this stuff. Well, as we'll see here in just a moment, that's not the case, because that's not what the Bible says. Okay, so verse 12, this is when the language shifts. Up until this point, it was talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and it was saying, he will set up siege works against you. He will direct the blows of his battering rams. His horses will be so many. Okay, then verse 12, what happens? It starts using a different word. It says, they will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. I will put an end to your noisy songs, and the music of the harps will be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. Okay, so suddenly, it's not talking about he, Nebuchadnezzar, it's talking about they. Well, who's they? In context of the verse, what did it say at the beginning? It said that many nations, as waves crashing against the shore, that many nations would be coming up against Tyre. And so they does not have to apply to Nebuchadnezzar. But what does that mean when it says, they will lay your stones in the midst of the water? Well, in 332 BC, a man named Alexander the Great, who you've probably heard of, laid siege to Tyre. And his conquering style was nothing like Nebuchadnezzar's, in that he wanted to conquer all of the known world in as short a time as possible. He was a very, very fast conqueror. So instead of attempting to wait out the enemy and like Nebuchadnezzar did and surround them, he just attacked them head on. The way he did this is he actually took all of the stones and the materials that were left over from when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the mainland Tyre, and he had his army throw it into the ocean and started to create like a land bridge over to the island. And I've got an illustration of that. Oh, here we go. So this is the best picture that I could find. Now, he also had these things that, just big towers, big wooden towers that would protect the workers who were building this land bridge from archers. It also, when they got close to the wall, his army could scale the wall immediately and without any risk of getting shot by archers. And I just love this because it looks like something straight out of Lord of the Rings, like something the orcs have. And like if I saw that coming at me, I'd think we're doomed, and they're definitely doomed. So the entire city of Tyre, the original old mainland city, was thrown into the ocean. And when Alexander the Great did reach the city, he totally wiped them out. He killed everyone, every animal. He totally wiped them out. And he didn't just beat them, he annihilated them. So when he built this causeway to the city, the sediment and sand began to build up, which created this peninsula that we see today. You can still see the remnants of the old city on the bottom. We also have, this is Tyre today. So it's actually like a city again, but it's, so we're going to talk about that too, because what about the verse that says it will never be built up again? And I'll get into that. And that is actually the next challenge from skeptics, is they say that a city was obviously rebuilt because there's this fishing community there today. But what exactly was rebuilt? Did the people of that day survive, return, and pick up the pieces and put them all back the way they were supposed to go? No, because the pieces are still right there in the ocean on that causeway. You can still see it. Now, God was not saying that no one can ever live on that piece of property ever again. What he said is that the Tyre from the 4th century BC would be totally wiped out completely, and that's exactly what happened. What is there today is not the old Tyre that used to exist. As a matter of fact, if you go there and you take like a tour on a boat, the guides will point to the sunken city and say, that's old Tyre right there. You can see it. They're making this distinction between the old and the new. When the Twin Towers fell, I remember they were considering on rebuilding it before they eventually decided to just make it a memorial. And if they did, if they built 2 towers, the exact same measurements as the old ones, would you say that they were the same towers as before? Is that what we would say about those? No, even if they were similar, they are a new set of towers, not the originals. There's a couple reasons why the new Tyre doesn't qualify for being rebuilt. One is that none of the original materials were used to reconstruct it. You know, there's the example that, or the, the dilemma or whatever that people talk about where they say, you know, you have a boat and you need to start, you start replacing a plank at a time. And eventually you've replaced every single plank. And is that boat still the old boat, or is it a new boat now? What then if you take all those old planks and then you reassemble them into a boat? Now, is that the old boat, or is the new boat the old boat? So those parts that were used in the original city are still in the sea to this day, or not really in the sea anymore, but in the ground. A second reason why it doesn't qualify for being rebuilt with that word is because it isn't even placed in the same spot as the original. And then third, it doesn't resemble the original. It would be as though I had built, you know, the Death Star out of Legos, and someone came in and they smashed it to pieces, and then they take a bunch of Duplos and they kind of throw them together and they make a square out of them. And then they say, here you go, I fixed it for you. Here's the Death Star that you had. I would say, no, you didn't. That's nothing like what I had built. That's not the same thing at all. That's pretty much it that I have for tonight. Next week, we'll have more cool prophecies to go through. I won't be doing an exhaustive list because I've heard numbers that get into the 5 figures as far as how many prophecies there are, maybe even more than that. I don't know, but it's crazy. So obviously we can't, just list them out. It would just, you wouldn't actually absorb that content. But hopefully we'll go through enough between tonight and next week to show that the Bible isn't just some book. People didn't just write it and make human mistakes. No, the Bible is something much more. It's not hard to prove historically that the prophecies came before the events that we spoke about. And while skeptics have arguments, such as the ones we already talked about, you find that those arguments don't stand up to the facts. Modern-day science says that any non-natural things that happen in the Bible must be myths or fairy tales because scientifically it can't be proven or explained. But that mentality has the assumption that miracles just cannot happen. However, fulfilled prophecy is a miracle, and only the Bible has it. I hope that this has been enlightening and encouraging, and hope to see you next week.